The air in the processing center hung thick and cold, a precise, unpleasant mixture of industrial-strength ammonia, lukewarm synthetic coffee, and the cloying, pervasive smell of nervous, unwashed sweat. It was the scent of institutional transition, the moment where civilian life bled out, and the uniform was pressed onto the soul. Sergeant Valdez stood motionless, a still point in a constantly churning system. She was currently identified only by a 6-digit temporary tag, taped to her thin, pale wrist, standing on a slightly warped strip of linoleum that had seen decades of boots and blood pressure checks. Her clothing, a loose-fitting faded gray tank top and sweatpants she'd slept in the night before, felt alien and ridiculously fragile against the sterile brutality of the room. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, irritating buzz, casting the entire space in a sickly, blue-white glare that magnified every dust mote dancing in the air and highlighted the exhaustion etched around the eyes of the 20 or so other recruits clustered around the measuring stations. Valdez was waiting for the final, critical stage of her induction, the full physical examination, the last bureaucratic hurdle before the actual suffering began. Her mind was a perfectly engineered quiet room, a place where only necessary data was processed. She focused on the texture of the cool, smooth metal railing she was leaning against, contrasting it with the clammy stickiness of her own skin. A shadow fell over her. It wasn't just a shadow. It was the embodied presence of raw, unchanneled aggression, the kind of carefully cultivated menace designed to break spirits before muscles. All right, you pathetic lot. Move it. Time is a finite resource, and I am not spending one goddamn microsecond more than necessary looking at the sad sacks of lard you call bodies. The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Sterling. Sterling was a textbook drill instructor, bald, necklace, with a complexion permanently set to the shade of boiled ham. He moved with a jerky, hyper-efficient energy, his perfectly starched fatigues rustling loudly, the sound like sandpaper rubbing against itself. He held a clipboard loosely in his left hand, the pencil tapping a frantic, irregular rhythm against the plastic surface. Sterling stopped directly in front of Valdez, his breathing heavy and audible, smelling faintly of cheap tobacco and industrial-strength mouthwash. His eyes, small and dark, raked over her from the worn-out sneaker tips to the loose strands of dark hair tied back haphazardly. Valdez met his gaze without blinking, her expression utterly neutral. This was the first test, and she knew the response protocol. Absorb, assess, offer nothing. You, Sterling barked, stabbing the air with his pencil tip an inch from her nose. Tag 689er. You look like you've been sleeping in dumpsters. Civilian clothes off, now. Get on the scale. Valdez pushed off the railing, the movement economical and fluid, lacking any hesitation or dramatic sigh. She reached for the hem of her tank top. The cotton was threadbare, soft from countless washes, a small comfort she was now shedding. The room temperature felt significantly colder the moment the fabric cleared her torso. She dropped the shirt neatly onto the floor beside her shoes. She stepped onto the heavy-duty scale. The digital readout stuttered, then settled. Sterling leaned in close, checking the number against the paperwork. He frowned. You're underweight, 689er. Significantly. You trying to tell me you've been living off air and good intentions? Valdez opened her mouth, but the answer, a carefully prepared line about a fast metabolism, died on her tongue. Sterling wasn't looking at her face anymore. His gaze had locked onto the upper slope of her right shoulder blade, trailing down towards the center of her back. The tattoo. It was not a traditional military tattoo. It was deliberately minimalist, almost deliberately vague when viewed partially. The visible portion, rising just above the line of the standard-issue, low-cut sports bra she wore, appeared to be nothing more than an abstract piece of black ink, a dense layered curl of stylized vine, or perhaps a single graceful feather, drawn with meticulous precision. It was artistic yet incomplete, like a high-resolution detail of a larger, classical fresco. Sterling snorted, a sharp, dismissive sound. He leaned in further, violating the critical distance. What in the sweet hell is that supposed to be? He sneered, the words laced with profound derision. A butterfly? Did you get lost on the way to the sorority mixer, sweetheart? That looks like the kind of cheap, delicate nonsense some high school girl gets trying to be edgy. Valdez felt a slow, cold tightening in her chest. A familiar, deep-seated clench that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with protecting sanctity. The tattoo was not cheap, it was not delicate, and it was certainly not for Sterling's approval. "It's personal, Staff Sergeant," Valdez stated, her voice low, even, and utterly devoid of inflection. She kept her eyes forward, focusing on the green digital numbers of the scale display. Sterling chuckled, a grating, humorless sound that drew the attention of 3 other recruits in line. "Personal. Everything is personal, 689er. But when you wear the uniform, nothing is private. And frankly, this looks like dog shit. Is that supposed to be a wing? A bad piece of calligraphy? Jesus, we're turning away Marines with perfect ASVAB scores for this generation of delicate little flowers." He reached out a thick finger, heavy with a class ring, and tapped the skin directly beside the ink, a deliberate, intrusive touch that made Valdez's muscles instinctively coil. "You going to cover that up with makeup, recruit? We need warriors, not runway models with bad taste in body art. Maybe when you make it through the first 3 weeks you can earn something that actually means something. Something with blood and sweat attached, not some twee little piece of garden foliage." The word foliage hung in the sterile air, dripping with scorn. Valdez felt a metallic tang rise on the back of her tongue, the taste of old, suppressed rage. She took a slow, deep breath, counting to 4 on the inhale, counting to 6 on the hold. She knew, intimately, the weight of the Ghost Hawk insignia, both the ink on her back and the memory in her mind. That memory was heavy enough to crush Sterling and the entire medical bay into fine powder. The insult was not the judgment of the art, it was the judgment of the meaning. Sterling didn't just misunderstand, he desecrated. The memory of the tattoo's genesis was a raw, textured thing, a tapestry woven from sand, blood, and the high-pitched static of a dying radio. The ink had been applied not in a sterile parlor, but in a dusty, dimly lit concrete bunker outside Kandahar, 3 hours after Operation Cinderfall went sideways, then inverted, then utterly atomized. The needle was held by Doc Harris, a man whose hands were usually used for high-stakes field surgery, not art, and whose eyes were still red-rimmed and distant from the events of the last 72 hours. Valdez, then designated Sparrow, had been the only surviving member of Ghost Team Bravo 6, an elite, completely deniable Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC asset, specialized in deep penetration retrieval and assassination on targets deemed politically radioactive. Cinderfall was supposed to be a clean extraction of a high-value analyst gone rogue, carrying sensitive encryption keys. It became a graveyard. Valdez remembered the moonless night with painful clarity. They had been dropped 3 clicks from the target compound, the air biting cold despite the desert location, due to the altitude. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of their specialized boots on the fine, silt-like sand. The weight was staggering. Valdez carried the team's designated M240B, modified for lighter load, plus her personal loadout, enhanced communication gear, 9 spare magazines, water, and the requisite explosives package. Every pound was accounted for, calibrated for endurance. Yet after the 3rd hour of silent marching, every step felt like pressing against wet concrete. Sergeant Major Atlas Kincaid, their team lead, walked point, a massive man whose movements were surprisingly graceful. Valdez could only see the reflection of the NVG green in the dark lens of his helmet. "Sparrow, comms check." Atlas's voice crackled softly through her headset, a mere whisper that sounded monumental in the silence. "Solid, Atlas. Reading weak signature on target beacon, consistent with the predicted location of the underground cache. ETA, 20 minutes. Roger that. Hold pace. Don't breathe too loud, kids. The ghosts are listening tonight." They were crossing a dry riverbed, a wadi, when the world ended. It wasn't a sharp blast. It was a terrifying, compressed thump, followed instantly by the sickeningly wet sound of tearing metal and flesh. The ground shuddered. Dust and debris shot 50 feet into the air. It was a daisy-chained IED, buried beneath a cluster of ancient dried scrub brush, a position the intelligence had sworn was clear. The lead half of the patrol, Atlas and Doc Harris, vanished in a blinding, instantaneous flash. Valdez, walking third, felt the concussive wave hit her like a physical fist to the chest, driving the air from her lungs. Her ears registered only a high-pitched, permanent whine. The M240B slammed against her sternum, knocking her backwards onto the sand. When she tried to sit up, the reality hit. The air was thick with the metallic, pungent smell of detonated explosives and human tissue. Where Atlas and Harris had been standing, there was only a crater, steaming faintly in the cold air. The remaining three, Valdez, Lieutenant Commander Reyes, and Specialist Thorne, no relation to the Admiral but a tough kid from Brooklyn, were staggered but miraculously intact, protected by the sheer mass of Atlas's equipment absorbing the blast. "Contact! Contact!" Reyes screamed into the silent void, scrambling to pull his M4 up, the movement clumsy, fueled by shock. But the IED was not the only trap. The explosion was the signal. From the surrounding ridges, the synchronized chatter of heavy machine guns opened up. They were pinned immediately. Tracer rounds stitched the sand inches from Reyes's head. "Reyes, cover! Thorne, establish fire superiority to the north! Go!" Valdez screamed, fighting the deafening ringing in her ears, her own hands flying automatically to the M240B. This was not a skirmish. It was an ambush laid with devastating precision. They had walked into a net. Thorne, bless his heart, managed to get 3 bursts off, suppressing the primary firing position on the ridgeline. Valdez knew they had maybe 60 seconds before the enemy fire became overwhelming. "Reyes, status of Atlas and Doc." Reyes, already low on the ground, shook his head frantically. "Gone, Sparrow, completely. I can't see them. Just the crater." The mission parameters slammed into Valdez's mind. Extraction of the package was paramount. Failure to recover the encryption keys meant years of intelligence infrastructure were compromised. Bravo 6 was deniable, but the package was not. Valdez looked at Reyes, his face pale and slick with sweat under the moonlight. She looked at Thorne, who was already low on ammo and moving stiffly, having taken shrapnel in his thigh. They couldn't hold. They had to move. "New objective," Valdez announced, her voice rock-steady despite the tremor running through her hands. "Thorne, give me suppressing fire, full saturation. Reyes, you and I are getting that package, now." "Sparrow, we can't. The compound is a mile away and we're surrounded," Reyes protested, his fear momentarily overcoming discipline. "We don't have an hour, Reyes. We have 7 minutes until they converge. We breach, we retrieve, we get out. Thorne, if we don't come back, you exfil solo. Rendezvous at LZ Hawk. Repeat, LZ Hawk." Thorne, barely conscious, nodded stiffly, gripping his rifle tighter. Valdez took the lead, pulling the pin on a fragmentation grenade and tossing it towards the densest point of the enemy fire, buying them a precious 3 seconds. They ran. They ran low, dodging the constant stream of fire, using the meager dips and dunes of the terrain as cover. The weight of the M240B felt impossible, but Valdez focused only on the churning sand beneath her feet. When they reached the perimeter wall of the compound, they were both breathing in ragged gasps, the adrenaline beginning to crash into sheer exhaustion. "Reyes, breach charge, right side of the gate." Reyes fumbled with the C4 packet, his hands shaking violently. Valdez covered him, emptying a short belt of 7.60 mm rounds into the guard tower 50 yards away. The charge detonated with a sharp, controlled blast, creating a ragged hole in the compound wall. They went in. The interior was a labyrinth of stone internal pouch. "Reyes, cover the door, we move out." But Reyes didn't answer. Valdez turned. Reyes was leaning against the wall, his head bowed. She saw the dark, blooming wetness spreading across his lower back and waistline. A stray round, or perhaps a piece of flying shrapnel from the breach, had found its mark. "Reyes!" He looked up, pain clouding his eyes. "Go, Sparrow. I'm slowing you down, my leg. It's done." The harsh realization settled. If she tried to carry Reyes, the Ghost Hawk insignia, the unit's internal honor code, would force her to stay and die with him. But the mission, the titanium drive, was non-negotiable. Valdez looked at the drive in her pouch, then back at Reyes, who was rapidly losing consciousness. The rules were cruel, absolute. Deniable assets do not leave evidence, and they do not sacrifice the objective for sentiment. "I'm sorry, Reyes," she choked out, the first crack in her armor all night. She took the pistol from Hydra's slack hand. She knew what she had to do. They couldn't leave the rogue agent alive, and they couldn't leave the wounded. She performed the final, terrible duty of the Ghost Hawk unit with surgical coldness, ensuring no suffering and absolute silence. It was the hardest trigger pull of her life. Valdez emerged from the bunker alone, the titanium drive burning like ice against her side. She found Thorne exactly where she left him, dead, a perfect circle of spent brass around his position, having used every last round to ensure her entry. She was the last one. Bravo 6 was extinguished. Valdez ran through the desert for 3 hours, not towards the planned LZ, which was likely compromised, but towards a mountain pass only known to the highest echelon of the unit, a geographical shadow only Sparrow had memorized years earlier during advanced training. She reached the extraction point at dawn, crawling the last few yards onto the designated rock outcropping, her lungs screaming for air, her uniform ripped and stained black with dirt and the blood of 3 good men. The insignia, the Ghost Hawk, was the phoenix that rose from that dust, a promise and a scar. Doc Harris, miraculously having survived the initial blast with severe fragmentation wounds, was recovered 3 days later, and upon stabilization, was the one who personally inscribed the symbol onto Valdez's back in the immediate aftermath of her debrief. It was a ritual of survival and remembrance. The initial superficial part of the tattoo, the delicate stylized wing that Sterling mocked, was intentionally designed to look innocuous, a piece of pretty throwaway art. It was the cover. The rest of the intricate design, the true insignia, was hidden, camouflaged by the curvature of her musculature, unless she stood at a specific angle or extended her shoulders in a precise manner. It wasn't just a skull. It was a stylized, predatory raptor head superimposed over the remnants of an exploded compass rose, denoting the team's ultimate sacrifice for directional integrity. It was the Ghost Hawk, the sign of the one who walks alone in the shadow. Back in the fluorescent-lit processing room, the sheer aggression radiating from Staff Sergeant Sterling was a physical pressure. "Sweetheart, I asked you a question," Sterling repeated, his voice dropping slightly, attempting to inject a patronizing intimacy that was infinitely worse than his shouting. He was still fixed on the partially visible ink. "You planning on keeping that stupid piece of foliage?" Valdez shifted her weight slightly on the scale, the movement barely perceptible. She could hear the rustle of the paper gown of the recruit standing behind her, waiting for the measuring station. "Staff Sergeant," Valdez began, her voice still quiet, but carrying a sharp underlying current that made Sterling momentarily pause. "The regulation states that non-offensive personal body art is permissible, provided it is not visible while in regulation uniform or on parade. I assure you, this falls within the accepted parameters." Sterling bristled at the technicality. "Don't quote regulations to me, 689er. I am the regulation here, and I am telling you that looks unprofessional. What's it supposed to be, a tribal motif? Or did your yoga instructor draw that on you with a Sharpie?" He was baiting her, pushing for the emotional reaction that would justify writing her up for insolence or failure to comply. He wanted her to break the silence, to offer the weakness he was looking for. Valdez finally turned her head, fixing her cool, hazel eyes on his. "It is neither, Staff Sergeant. It is an insignia." "An insignia?" Sterling laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Insignia? You're a recruit. The only insignia you rate is the laundry number on your underwear. Get off the scale, move to the measuring tape, and maybe next time, choose something that doesn't look like it belongs on a $5 greeting card." Valdez stepped off the scale. The movement was slow, deliberate. She did not immediately move toward the measuring station. Instead, she took a single, precise step back, angling her body away from the direct light source, subtly changing the curve of her back muscles. Then, she performed the Ghost Hawk salute, a movement almost never done in public, requiring absolute physical control. It involved a slight internal rotation of the shoulders and a subtle extension of the sternum, designed not to be an outward show of strength, but a momentary reshaping of the underlying structure. The movement was brief, lasting less than a second, but it was enough. The ink, which moments ago had looked like abstract foliage, suddenly clicked into anatomical alignment. The graceful wing was revealed to be the upper curved arch of a massive, stylized raptor's skull, its beak sharp and downward curving. The surrounding lines, which had appeared messy or decorative, were now seen as the shattered circumference of a tactical compass rose. The hidden detail, the eye socket of the skull, contained 3 tiny, perfectly etched Roman numerals, denoting the lost members of Bravo 6. The full image was stark, aggressive, and undeniably military, but from a military that Sterling knew nothing about. It was the embodiment of cold, efficient death. Sterling was still mid-chuckle. His eyes scanned her back one last time, ready to deliver the final, crushing line of dismissal. He saw the image resolve. The laughter died in his throat. Not just stopped, but extinguished, leaving a terrible, ringing silence. His jaw went slack. The flush on his neck drained away, leaving a patchy, unhealthy pallor. He stared at the ink as if it were a physical wound that had just opened in the air. His highly trained brain, accustomed to recognizing every military crest, every unit patch, every rank insignia from every branch, registered the symbol as terrifyingly familiar, and yet utterly non-existent. The power and the sheer quality of the artwork suggested an organization that dealt only in perfection and permanence. This was not the work of a local tattoo artist. It was a mark of belonging to something hidden, ancient, and lethal. Sterling's bravado evaporated, replaced by a deep, visceral unease. He started to lean closer again, involuntarily, compelled to verify what his eyes were telling him. What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse, the volume dropping so severely that only Valdez could hear it. Valdez held the pose for only a moment longer, allowing the insignia to fully imprint on his mind. Then she relaxed her posture. The symbol retracted, returning to the abstract curl of the sweet little wing. She said nothing. She simply waited, her breath steady, her heart rate remaining exactly where her years of training had placed it, 60 beats per minute, regardless of stress. The silence that followed stretched, punctuated only by the distant squeak of a medical cart wheeling down the hallway. Sterling stood frozen, clutching his clipboard, his confidence utterly shattered by the flash of black ink. He looked less like a drill instructor and more like a man who had just seen a ghost walk through a closed door. It was at this precise, suspended moment of psychological combustion that the inspection team arrived. They moved with an entirely different kind of efficiency than the enlisted personnel, polished, silent, and weighted with authority. The air pressure in the hallway seemed to visibly shift as they approached. Leading the party was Admiral Elias Thorne. Thorne was not a man built for shouting in barracks. He was thin, impeccably tailored in a crisp white uniform, and his posture suggested 4 decades spent in the claustrophobic confines of aircraft carriers and deep strategy sessions. His face was a roadmap of old worries and high-level decisions, his eyes sharp and permanently narrowed from years of staring at charts and political risks. Admiral Thorne was the Chief of Naval Operations, and unofficially, the highest-ranking officer currently overseeing the Joint Services recruiting effort. He was on a morale and accountability tour, which mostly consisted of walking silently and observing, until something struck him as inefficient or poorly managed. He stopped just inside the entrance to the medical bay, his inspection team, a stiff general, 2 aides, and a Navy captain, fanning out respectfully behind him. His gaze swept the room, pausing on the lines of recruits, the cleanliness of the instruments, and the general conduct of the staff. His eyes landed inevitably on Staff Sergeant Sterling, who was standing rigid and unnaturally still, beside a slight, bare-backed female recruit, his face shining with a thin film of anxious sweat, holding a clipboard like a flotation device. Thorne frowned. Drill instructors were supposed to be loud, dynamic, and aggressively engaged. Sterling looked like he had just been electrocuted. "Staff Sergeant?" Thorne's voice was low, carrying effortlessly across the room, demanding instant attention. "Is there a problem here?" Sterling snapped instantly to attention, the movement so sudden it was almost painful to watch. "No, Admiral. No problem, sir. Just processing, sir." Valdez, still standing slightly offset from the scale, observed the exchange. She knew Admiral Thorne by reputation, a hard man, a strategic genius, and a long-standing fixture in the Joint Chiefs. More importantly, she knew he was one of the 4 original founding members of the Ghost Hawk Initiative, responsible for its initial funding and deep deniability charter. She did not turn around. She kept her back to the group, but maintained the precise, calculated tension in her shoulders that allowed the Ghost Hawk insignia to remain fully visible, a dark, complex diagram against the pale canvas of her skin. Admiral Thorne walked slowly toward Sterling, his shoes clicking precisely on the linoleum. He wasn't looking at Sterling. He was looking past him, at the recruit who was causing the irregularity. "Processing seems to have stalled, Staff Sergeant," Thorne noted, his tone mild but laced with a lethal impatience. He stepped around Sterling, intending to address the recruit directly. He stopped. The Admiral's breathing, which had been perfectly controlled and measured, stuttered. It was the subtle, almost inaudible hitch of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. He saw the tattoo. He saw the stylized wing, the graceful dark curvature. And then, his eyes, trained for 3 decades to spot pattern recognition and hidden complexity, registered the truth in the curvature of the muscles, the perfect alignment of the skull, the precise geometry of the exploded compass rose, and the hauntingly specific Roman numerals contained within the raptor's eye socket. The air solidified. Admiral Thorne knew that symbol. He had commissioned that symbol. He had attended the deeply secret midnight memorial service for Bravo 6, where the unit's fate was confirmed. He had signed the initial disbursement authorization for the retrieval of the drive that Valdez had secured, the drive that saved half a decade of counter-terrorism operations. He knew that symbol meant Sparrow, and Sparrow had been declared KIA, presumed eliminated by enemy combatants to protect the unit's absolute secrecy, and to remove her name from any and all military records, protecting her from endless pursuit by those who knew what she had secured. The shock was immediate, profound, and physically debilitating. It was not just the recognition of the Ghost Hawk, a symbol known only to approximately 30 people worldwide. It was the impossible appearance of a soldier who, by all accounts, did not exist anymore. Thorne's face, usually the epitome of granite control, went through an agonizing series of micro-expressions. First disbelief, narrowing his eyes to slits, then a crushing realization. Finally, something akin to stark terror, the terror of a man whose perfectly constructed world of plausible deniability had just suffered a catastrophic public breach. The young sergeant standing before him, stripped bare and exposed, was not a recruit. She was a legend, a shadow, a necessary lie, and she had just deliberately revealed her truth in front of a staff sergeant and an inspection team. The Admiral's hands, clasped loosely behind his back, clenched into white-knuckled fists. He felt the cold shock running down his spine, bypassing the brain entirely, and hitting the core of his survival instinct. He had to act. Now. He looked at Sterling, who was still paralyzed, staring at the recruit's back, trying desperately to reconcile the butterfly with the sudden undeniable appearance of something far older and more dangerous. Thorne didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat had constricted. Instead, the highest-ranking officer in the room, a man who commanded fleets and air wings, performed the ultimate impossible gesture. Admiral Thorne slowly, meticulously, brought his right hand up to his brow. His eyes were locked on the tattoo, the Ghost Hawk, the emblem of ultimate sacrifice. He snapped off a salute. It was not a casual recognition. It was a razor-sharp, immediate, and utterly involuntary mark of respect, the kind of salute one offers only to a flag, a fallen comrade, or a superior officer of mythic status. The entire inspection team froze. The general standing behind Thorne, a man who had worked with him for 20 years, watched the gesture with dawning horror. Admirals do not salute recruits in their underwear, ever. The sheer power of the action, the sudden violent breach of protocol, ricocheted through the sterile room. Staff Sergeant Sterling, who was watching the scene unfold, finally broke. His eyes, darting from the recruit's back to the Admiral's rigid saluting form, widened to dinner plates. The full, terrifying context of the situation hit him like a physical blow. The piece of foliage was an active high-level code. The recruit he had mocked and patronized was not only military royalty, but a shadow asset whose existence required an admiral to break every rule of engagement. Sterling understood, in one searing instant, that he had just committed professional suicide, possibly treason, and might very well have signed his own death warrant simply by looking at the symbol. A tremor started in his hands, spreading rapidly up his arms. The clipboard slipped from his numb fingers, hitting the floor with a hollow, echoing clatter. He tried to speak, to offer an apology, a defense, anything, but the sound caught in his throat, emerging as a wet, desperate gasp. Admiral Thorne held the salute. He was sending a silent message, across rank, across branch, and across the veil of absolute secrecy. I see you. I recognize your sacrifice, and I am subordinate to your mission integrity. Valdez remained still, accepting the salute without flinching, her face a mask of cold professionalism. She had achieved her objective. Sterling was neutralized, and her status was subtly confirmed to the one man who needed to know she was back on the board. After 3 agonizing seconds, seconds that felt like the entire duration of the Cold War, Thorne slowly lowered his hand, his eyes never leaving Valdez's back. He turned slowly to the general beside him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously quiet, resonating with a cold, absolute authority. "General," Thorne said, making eye contact, "the situation has changed. This recruit, Tag 689er, is no longer participating in the standard induction process." He looked at Sterling, whose face was now slick with sweat, his eyes darting frantically. "Staff Sergeant Sterling," Thorne continued, his voice hardening into something sharp and unforgiving, "you are relieved of duty immediately. Report to Colonel Matthews for debriefing and psychological evaluation. You are to speak to no one about the events of the last 5 minutes, under penalty of court-martial and potential reassignment to extremely remote administrative duties." The implied threat was clear. Speak and vanish. Sterling could only nod, a spastic movement of his head, too terrified to even attempt a vocal response. He stumbled backward, his carefully constructed persona of aggressive dominance utterly obliterated. Thorne stepped closer to Valdez, now speaking in a low, conspiratorial whisper, his demeanor shifting from Admiral to co-conspirator. "Sparrow," he breathed, "we thought you were gone. What in God's name are you doing here? The paperwork indicates a standard enlistment under your civilian name." Valdez finally turned, her neutral gaze meeting his. The coolness in her eyes was alarming. "Admiral," she responded, her voice returning to its normal, calm register. "I am cleaning up a loose end, a very old loose end that Cinderfall left behind. It requires deep cover integration into a secure environment, and the structure of a standard recruit is the deepest cover available." Thorne understood instantly. Ghost Hawk protocol mandated that any mission objective, no matter how dangerous or improbable, must be concluded. If Cinderfall had left a lingering threat, Valdez would be the one to hunt it down, regardless of the years of silence. "The threat, is it internal?" Thorne asked, his voice now etched with grave concern. "Substantially," Valdez confirmed. "The analyst Hydra did not work alone, sir. I need access to the highest level of classified systems, and I need a deniable asset status without the interference of standing military intelligence. I need to be a ghost, moving through the system unobserved." Thorne absorbed this information, the implications of Valdez's clandestine return, sending tremors through his strategic planning. A Ghost Hawk back in play, inside the system, meant the threat was massive. "We will facilitate," Thorne stated simply, "but the risk of exposure is astronomical. You cannot afford another incident like this." He gestured subtly toward Sterling, who was now being quietly escorted away by one of Thorne's aides, his face pale green. "Understood, Admiral," Valdez said, but the need for confirmation of identity outweighed the risk of exposure to one non-essential individual. I needed to know that my support structure was still intact, and that the code was still recognized. She was testing him, and he had passed. His immediate fearful recognition and subsequent salute confirmed that the sanctity of the Ghost Hawk unit remained absolute, even years after its presumed dissolution. "The unit is always intact, Sparrow," Thorne confirmed, his voice regaining its command presence. "You are the living proof of that integrity. Now, get dressed. Captain Roberts," he addressed the Navy captain on his inspection team, "you will personally escort Sergeant Valdez to a secure location. She is to be fitted with full, specialized gear. She is no longer a recruit. She is now under immediate executive transfer order. Designation, White Phantom." Thorne paused, looking back at the spot where the tattoo had been fully revealed. He saw only the smooth, pale skin, the faint, deceptive curve of the delicate wing. The true symbol was hidden again, awaiting the next moment of necessity. "And Sergeant Valdez," Thorne added, meeting her eyes with a profound depth of respect that spanned decades of service. "Welcome back from the shadow." Valdez gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She reached down, picked up her simple, faded gray tank top, and slid it back over her head. The mundane fabric covered the legend, sealing the secret once more. The room, which had briefly held the chilling reality of high-stakes black ops, returned to its stale, predictable normalcy. The other recruits, distracted by the removal of the shouting instructor and the sudden, silent departure of the elite officers, simply returned to their shuffle, entirely unaware that a nuclear device had just been armed and recached beneath the floorboards of the U.S. military. The mission was now underway. The Sparrow had flown back into the darkness.